Hi, this is Rick for EDU Mobile. Now we're going to look at a dynamically created view. By that I mean that the view is not actually going to be created, or a subview of the main view here, is not actually going to be created until down here in View Did Load. So what does this look like? Well, first of all, my storyboard has, as we had before, a selected or a segmented control that is wired to an IB action method. Red, green, and blue. And we're going to do exactly the same thing, but the view down here I'm going to dynamically create and load at runtime. Color view is going to be a passive control, if you will, a view, that we're going to change the properties of. So it really is an outlet, but because we don't do any wiring in Interface Builder, the IB Interface Builder outlet annotation is not required. However, our action method does require the IB action annotation because in this case we are wiring the action up to a segmented control and switching on the selected segment index of that control to do the changes to our passive view. This method is exactly the same as the last method, with the exception that in the default case I'm just printing out the selected segment index so I can figure out what happened if something went wrong. So let's look at creating this view dynamically. This is really a pretty simple procedure. A view, a UI view, needs to have a frame in which to display itself. A frame is just a rectangle, and we have a structure in the hierarchy of UI kit that is called a CG rect. So if we make a frame, let color view frame equal, and then we can use a function of that structure, CG rect make, to give it its top left corner. In this case, the left coordinate is 120, the top is 300, and I'm just sort of hard coding these values to get the view in the approximate horizontal center of the main view's frame. So the length and width are 140 and 140. Then I can make color view. Color view is a UI view, so I can just assign it here as a UI view, and then UI view has a constructor that takes the frame, and so we pass it the frame. Then we can set the background color. Here I'm setting it to red because the selected segment index of my segmented control is going to default to index 0, which in this case is red. And then notice this piece, probably the most important piece, is adding the color view as a subview to UI view. And this puts color view into UI view, into views subviews array. So this should all work, and in fact it does. We'll go ahead and run it now. Here's my default splash screen, and there we go. So I can change UI view's color to green and blue, and it all works. The color property of this subview here is, I should say, is behaving as a passive control because we are passively, in code in other words, changing that color to whatever. All right, so let's look at this implicit unwrapping of this optional. What would happen if somehow this view never got created? So I'll comment that out. And now if we run, first of all, we see no compiler errors, even though we're going to a property of color view, and color view now doesn't exist in any real sort of way. So let's run it again and see what happens. Remember, I have no compile time error here. So the view didn't appear, but we can still change the segmented index here, and now fatal error. And my error is unexpectedly found nil while unwrapping an optional value. All right, so what can we do to silence this error? Now, in this case, it's a good error. While we're developing, we want this error because we did something wrong. We did not initialize the view before we tried to use it. So we get a runtime error. Well, we can silence this error by checking to see if the optional has a value before we access its property. And we can do that simply by putting a question mark operator every time we try to access color view's property, its background color property. So we can silence it. It's not really a good thing to do, but I'm showing you something that will kind of be a springboard into the next thing we're going to do. We can see that even though the view never gets created, we can still change the selected segment index. And what it's doing here is saying, well, if it's nil, don't try to go to the background color property. Don't do anything at all. Just allow that selected segment index to change. So now you're probably asking me at this point, why would I want to do that anyway? Why would I not want that error? Because that would tell me that color view has not yet been created and I should fix my code. And you're right. But let's play with this a little bit and see where we can really make this useful. I'm going to go ahead into the storyboard and add a button and then add a method to deal with that button as an action. And that button will show and hide the color view. It'll be kind of a toggle between showing and hiding the color view. After I do this, we'll look at the code and see how it's implemented. Okay, so I've added a button here called show, or actually the text on it right now is show. And we can see how I've wired that up to a method called show hide. And that is wired up to that show button's touch up inside event. So now, if I go back to my view controller and take a look at what I've done here. First of all, I've got a show hide method, which is an IB action method, and the sender is a button. Now, I could use inner object, but I need to get to the button's properties because this button is going to function as a toggle. If I click it when it says show, I am going to show the color view. Actually, I'm going to create it and add it as a subview. So I've just moved this code from ViewDidLoad into this handler. I've had to do a couple of other things. I need to set the button's text to hide, and the way I do that is use sender setTitle, the setTitle method, hide, and then for a control state. And normally this is UI control state normal. I've also forced color select back to red. Now I could look at color selects. Well, what is color select? Color select is an outlet that I put on the segmented control itself, and this way I can get to it and set a property of it. So color select, I've set its segment index to the red segment, or 0, because I'm going to create a color view with a red color. I could have done it the other way. I could have looked at color select selected segment index and then done something like this before to do this. Otherwise, I want to set the title on the button to show, and then what am I going to do? I'm going to remove color view from its super view, which is this view controller's view, and then I'm going to get rid of it. I'm setting it to nil. So every time color view, or every time this button is pressed to show that color view, it's going to be recreated. Now, if while that color view is not being shown, I try to change the color on this using the segmented control, and I don't check to see if this optional has a value, then I'm going to get that runtime error that I showed you before. So I need to make sure, I need to check that this optional has a value. And the way I do that is use optional chaining, which is what I'm doing here. I am chaining that color view. This says I want to change the background color, but only if color view has a value and never if it is nil. So let's run this and see if it works, and make sure that while I'm not displaying the color view, I can still change the selected segment index, and I can. Now, if I hit show when this is something other than red, I get my color view. This changes back to red because I'm forcing it to be red, and I can change the selected segment index, which will passively change the color on the color view. I can hide it. Everything's cool again. I can show it. It goes back to red because I'm creating it red and forcing it to go to the red segment, and then I can change this as well. This is why we use an implicitly unwrapped optional for our properties, and this is also why we want to make sure so that we use the question mark operator to check the optional to see if it's not nil before we use it. Thank you very much.